Hello, you lovely people. It has been a minute, hasn't it? Thanos and I have been very, very busy building new things. However, we recently got together and said it's time to resurrect the podcast. So here we are. This video that I'm about to show you is from back, I believe, in November, December of last year. It was with our friend Ari Akerstein. Ari is the CEO of a company called OpenCancer AI. At the time, they had a different name. So every time you see them use the name, we're actually talking about OpenCancer AI. Ari is a cancer survivor, and cancer is a near and dear thing to my heart because my oldest son is also a cancer survivor. I hope that you guys really, really enjoy this episode. We talk a lot about how AI can help improve the outcomes in cancer. And yeah, you should start seeing a little more content out of us. I hope everybody has a great, phenomenal day and you enjoy the rest of the video. Bye. Hey folks, welcome to Will AI Snap That? Today we're on with Ari Akerstein. He is the CEO of Navis Health AI. And Ari is building a product that is not just about an answer engine. Ari is building an answer engine to help cancer patients, but also embedding it within a community of people. The work that he's doing is, quite frankly, astounding. And having heard a lot of the stories, I can tell you that I am very touched by the work he's doing. And in his explanations, I even teared up. We talk about a lot of things. There's a lot of philosophy in this, but at the very end, what we talk about a lot is what does it mean to have a good product? What does it mean to have an LLM as the core of a product? And how do you make sure it's giving you the right answers? How do you make sure that it is telling you the truth? And is that enough to make a product? So prior to that, we talked a lot about healthcare and trust and the medical system. So we really hope you enjoy this one, and we'll see you on the flip side. So, okay. So what I want to say is that we're going to talk today about Ari's startup. It's Navis Health, right? Okay.
Yep.
And our Navis Health AI. And we're going to get to that. But there's a much more important question here, which is, so do AIs do the same thing? If the AI is looking at a light pole, will it drive into it? I'm actually like very seriously wondering right now, because if you,
You mean because of training data somehow?
yeah, and obviously they're not going to drive into light poles because hopefully they're not driving. They can't do math. Let's let them not control a giant machine of metal. But like, I'm wondering if there's if they have a proclivity to, if you tell them to avoid something, if they'll end up moving towards it.
I doubt it because I'm no expert in this, but I would think that one of the metrics, as I understand it, for FSD full self-drive is like crashes per 100,000, something like this, comparing it to human equivalents. And if the objective function is don't crash, I would think that probably supersedes any faulty
Well,
trading data, although I'm no expert here
well,
at
so
all.
actually, I'm thinking about LLMs, meaning if you
Okay,
if you
gotcha.
tell the LLM,
The LLM
yeah,
equivalent
the LLM
of crashing
equivalent,
into
it's
a
like,
pole.
you will not do this. And then the LLM just does it over and over. And I'm like, I wonder if the LLM's anxious.
That
Like, is that what's happening?
uh, I mean, it's sort of reflective of the broader humanity, and most of us are anxious, so it's reasonable.
Yeah, that's my thinking. So, anyways, all right. Navis Health AI. Tell me what you do. And for the record, folks, like Ari and I have worked together before. Ari is a PM by trade, though recently it seems like all PMs are trying to figure out how to be engineers, and all engineers are trying to figure out how to be PMs. But no, I'm dead.
That's funny.
I am dead serious. Like, I'm dead serious. And so we actually work together at a healthcare startup, which we shall not name because it is the startup which shall not be named. But all right, tell us a little bit about yourself, about what you're doing. You know, we've talked before. I think
Yeah,
it's pretty incredible.
absolutely. So glad to be here. The merging of roles, I think, actually is real, even though I'm laughing.
Yeah.
I'm sort of laughing because I've been, doing product probably 15, 18 years at this point. And when you have me checking in code, which sometimes happens, it's definitely a fail mode. Like, this is not my forte, my expertise. I'm much
Mhm.
more on the product side. So something has gone horribly wrong with respect to staffing historically if,
Mhm.
Ari's checking in code, but it is fun. So in terms of me, kind of the quick, maybe 1 minute is
Mhm.
actually started out building, we were talking just before recording about healthcare devices. And so I started out my career actually after college building fitness equipment and making every possible product mistake
Mhm.
in the book. But I learned really quickly because I was using my own dollar. And so despite every stepping in every pothole, pulled off a win. Then went back to grad school, molecular biology, computational biology, then went to UCSF for a few years, thinking I wanted to go down this kind of academic path. This was in the early 2000s in San Francisco, and had the good fortune and maybe the good sense to kind of look left and look right at how
Mhm.
many postdocs I was looking at, which I think of as ramen years. And it wasn't particularly appealing when I was looking on the other side at startup land, which was incredible and much more in my strike zone. So
Yeah.
from there, I went into growth roles, product roles, places like Walmart Labs,
Mhm.
Meta, and the startup that shall not be named, along with smaller places and bigger places. There's a bit of a non sequitur here, which is that in 2018, I was diagnosed with an aggressive blood cancer. And so, living the dream, I think you know this, Michael.
Did I?
This is why, maybe you
Because
probably
we talked
forgot,
about my
but
son's cancer. That's right. That's right.
yeah, yeah. So that was quite eye-opening for me on a lot of dimensions. First off,
Mhm.
being a new dad, I had three kiddos living in San Francisco in startup world, and it's the equivalent of being hit by a bus. Without belaboring it, what it really opened my eyes to was that a lot of the things I took for granted about you build a better product, you
Mhm.
are thoughtful about design, you're intentional about engineering, all these kind of things that are just part of the ethos in the world that we're coming from in the Bay Area were literally like through the looking glass. Like it was just not even poorly designed, it was non-designed. And so I found myself as a patient sort of traversing these like two different modes, like totally different. Like on the one hand, you're putting on a spa hat and reading white papers about the latest treatments. On the other hand, navigating the system, which was almost more painful. And of course, while dealing with your mortality and all these emotional things at the same time. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I subsequently left sort of consumer tech at Facebook and that whole world, and really decided that I didn't want to be problem space agnostic, but rather I really wanted to commit into a particular domain, a particular problem space, and even more specifically, learn about kind of the ins and outs about a lot of areas that I didn't quite understand. The business models of a B2B to C. How does the regulatory kind of world work with respect to building in this space? How do clinicians think about their job and
Yeah.
what they're doing for patients? As we both know, this was the pandemic, and so we had telehealth, and we were one of the biggest telehealth companies out
Yeah.
there. And so seeing some of the scale problems
Mhm.
there. And so the net of it was like really what I wanted to get was learning about how does the space work writ large? I don't think you can just be kind of a generalist and sort of go
Mhm.
into the space. It's a little bit too uniquely weird, and domain specific. And so I learned a ton about what to do, what not to do, the patchwork of, regulations across states and everything in
Mhm.
between. But what I'm doing now is really taking some of those learnings from that company, but also more importantly, thinking about what the gaps were in my own experience and
Yeah.
subsequently in working with a lot of patients. What are the gaps that I'm seeing writ large in the overall ecosystem? And sort of building with the patient first. And everybody says that. In
Mhm.
fact, I sort of hate that language because
Right.
everybody says it and really it's not true. I sort of think of an energy landscape and you have a bunch of like local optimum all over the place and everyone's optimizing for the payer, for the
Mhm.
ROI on the employer, for the clinician happiness. But really the patient is kind of nowhere to be seen. But I think if there were a kind of global optimum there, it'd really be
Sure.
optimizing on the patient. And so that's a tricky proposition to get right, but that's where I've been spending a lot of my cycles thinking about that.
So yeah, and, it's worth mentioning. I don't know if I've mentioned it on the show. Like my oldest son had leukemia, and so I have, and my wife is a nurse, and
Hmm.
so we have a like intimate. We've had an intimate relationship with healthcare in general, and that is not an intimate relationship that pretty much anybody wants to have because it is tough, and because like you said, they everybody says we keep the patient first, and quite frankly the patient doesn't pay the bills, the insurance company does, and then the patient gets to follow up with everything that the insurance company doesn't cover, and the doctors are constrained by quite a few different things when it comes to caring for the patients. And so, at least here in the US, healthcare, you're right. The only acceptable thing to say is that we put the patient first, but often it's just lip service. And I think when you deal with a good doctor one on one, and I think most doctors qualify that way, then they put the patient first. But the industry and the organizations probably don't. They probably don't. So, and I was joking about the startup which shall not be named. I mean, it was Included Health. I was very proud of some of the work that I did there. And, we were involved in a lot of the same projects. And, but I saw that there where I tried to keep my eye directly on how is the patient going to feel using this. But institutionally, even though that was talked about a lot, I don't know that that was always a success metric that we always hit as an institution. And so it could be because, like, hey, a startup's a startup. You got to make money. And, if your biggest payer is asking you to do something that could potentially degrade the service of the patient, of the member, I'm going to tell you which one's probably going to win. So
Yeah.
it's a,
I think that's exactly right. And I don't think it's unique to any particular player in the ecosystem. I think what it comes down to is the incentives are just fundamentally misaligned for various reasons in different areas. And so, you'll be optimizing on, whatever axis makes the most sense. Typically it's revenue, and like that's okay. That's not a bad thing. I think
yeah,
it's
you have to make
um
money.
the point that you made earlier, I think, is the key of it, which is that, I mean, my way in on this is that I think, number one, I give the benefit of the doubt. Most people are trying their best in a system that is not set up for them or patients to be successful.
Right.
Like, doctors do not want to spend 12 minutes per patient. They didn't sign up for that necessarily, or
Mm-mm.
spending all their time in the EHR. They'll know that. I think everybody will admit that.
Yeah.
And that's not really, particularly insightful. The thing that definitely is sadly true is that it seems to me that engaged patients get better outcomes. Like, you just see it over
Yeah.
and again. And so if you're going to think about deferring your decisions, the sets of options in consideration to the doctor, it's likely that there will be gaps and opportunities. And, I think about that a lot. I think the clear way to say that is that care is high variance. And so it depends on your zip code, it depends on how active you are, it depends on what you're presenting with. There's a whole range of factors, but the point is that luck plays a disproportionate role in the types of outcomes that you're going to get. And if you think about any type of system that is coherent,
Mhm.
if you're reliant on luck for outcomes, probably there's a system design modification that would be in order to make that a better functioning system.
Yeah.
But again, you get back to the alignment problem, I think, at that point.
Yeah. Healthcare in general it's hard. It's tricky. There is not a one-to-one relationship any part of the system. And so when you don't have a one-to-one relationship between who is giving the care and who is receiving the care, right? There's always other parties involved. And so that means that without that direct one-to-one relationship, there is the likelihood of the outcome being steered in a direction that is not beneficial to both of the one-to-one parties is it's high. So
Yeah, that's right.
so
That's right.
how does AI help with that? Because we talked about your startup. We had a whole you and I talked about it. And I mean, there were a couple points where I like legitimately teared up thinking about some of the things you're doing,
Hmm,
talking to the patients that you have talked with.
thank you.
And, there were some moments where I'm just like, yeah, my boy's out there doing the Lord's right. Right.
My co-founder calls it God's work, and
Yeah.
I have to remind him. It
Exactly.
depends which God you're talking about.
Yeah,
It's not
well,
always so straightforward,
this
but
is true.
we'll
Yeah.
avoid that rabbit hole. Thank you. I feel the same way, and maybe if I just zoom out and kind of,
Mhm.
just talk about the problem space a little bit. I very much think about this from a patient lens, and so in a way, it's weirdly heretical to say that if you're doing
Mhm.
a startup, because as we know, the money is in the jumbo self-insured employers, the payers, the pharma, all the interests that that surround the patient. And so my way in is in thinking, number one, or maybe observing, positing that the patient is downstream from those interests. And so if you think about, oh, just take my chart as my favorite example. Like, this is not a tool that you would choose to use as a consumer. You're forced to in order to
Mhm.
actually receive care. And so, I mean, you can just look at my chart and just say, look, that wasn't built for patients. It's extended to patients for regulatory purposes and maybe, some window dressing around being patient centric, but 90% of that functionality is built for
Mhm.
providers. And so, anyway, the point of that is that, I kind of thread the needle on the patient. What do patients actually need? And observing that it's really a fragmented ecosystem. And some of these observations for me kind of came together from, just seeing what I personally went through. But also, as a sidebar on this, I started a small health tech incubator.
Mhm.
And so that's maybe a separate conversation that we don't have to go into. But essentially, think of it like a Venn diagram between the consumer AI kind of people, the world that we know, and the clinical life science kind of innovators. And so, what you have when you intersect those circles is an interesting watering hole where you have the clinicians learning from the consumer people because they all want to use, agentic AI and all the latest and greatest.
Mhm.
And similarly, you have, as you know, a really thorny landscape of regulatory and all these things and all these
Yeah.
interests in actually delivering care. And so there's a lot of cross pollination that, I think is unique and valuable. But one of the insights I took from this is that one of the big problems is actually just basic personalization, matchmaking, and some of the things that we would take for granted because of the siloed nature and, again, the misaligned interests. That tends to be more problematic than it should be. And so if you think about a patient and you think about what they need at any given point, there's a lot of gaps. And that could be just strictly from the care they're receiving to the things that, that aren't being presented. And so this is a very long-winded way of telling you that on the patient side, you have a fragmented, ecosystem. It's
Mhm.
really hard to know, do I trust my doctor? Do I trust them implicitly and do everything they say? Are there
Yeah.
additional things and questions and people to talk to? On the other side, you have a distribution problem for many of the kind of products and services that exist to support those kinds of patients. And these can run the gamut from clinical trial matching to precision diagnostics, where personally I've been spending a lot of time recently, to referrals into academic centers where it makes sense, where it doesn't make sense, second opinions. Anyway, there's a whole like advocacy groups, communities. There's a whole range of things that are relevant, but really hard to find and really hard to discover. And so if you want to think of it in pure CAC LTV terms, it kind of breaks down in a lot of ways. And on the other side, consumers don't really, or patients don't really shop in this country the way actually like in India, it's a little bit more normal to think of it in those terms.
Yeah.
And so it's a very somewhat irrational market in a lot of ways. But the way to answer your question on the AI side is I don't think of it as like an AI platform. It's got AI in the name, like yay. But I
Right.
think everybody does that. That's not how I so much think about this. In working with clinicians, I started thinking about kind of a weird topic. This may seem like a tangent, but I think it's not, which
Mhm.
is a lot about information asymmetries. And
Right.
so if you consider what the practice of medicine does, it fundamentally is about an information asymmetry. The doctor knows and the patient doesn't know. And so the world we're entering into now with agentic AI, and it's obviously moving faster than any of us can keep pace with it, is leveling that playing field. And so if I look at other areas where information asymmetry has sort of shifted over time, one can consider, I don't know, like trading with, Robinhood or Wealthfront or the kind of robo traders, or maybe higher ed with, Coursera and the MIT open courses and these kinds of things. You don't have to, go to the professor per se and get admission. There's a lot of friction that was obviated in achieving that kind of information parity with someone that was accepted to MIT, let's just say.
Mhm.
Or real estate is a good one, right? Like it feels like forever ago, but you used to have to go to the realtor who had the MLS to go and figure out this house and that house are available. And now, who starts their house search like not on Zillow or Redfin, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
it's
I
changed.
mean,
It's changed a lot. And so, in the one hand, there's a question about does that information asymmetry shift? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that when I look at the energy in the system, it's something like 100,000 patients uploaded their records to ChatGPT, and that doesn't necessarily mean they all trust, Sam A necessarily, but
right.
it seems not to matter in a weird way because the value and the speed and all those things is offsetting a lot of the friction fundamental to the system. And so that's a very interesting question, I think, which then leads you to well, what does the practice of medicine look like over the next 5, 10 years? It's like really interesting to consider perhaps an unbundling of some of the components of what it is that comprise that practice. And that's a whole other conversation we
Mhm.
don't have to go into. But I would posit that the information piece is probably the one that's maybe most interesting in the near term, which is to say that patients will present with a set of information that maybe even with the Dr. Google, so to speak, or included health or whatever, you're not going to be, I think, as close to parity with an MD. And that's not dismissing the work that MDs do. This is from my conversations with MDs, which I'm having all the time. And, they're equally like, I can't do my job without Chat GPT. It's incredible. So,
So the
oh, sorry,
oh,
to,
go ahead.
to,
No,
to
go ahead.
finish, to finish the thing. So I see the design of systems, and now I'll actually answer your question,
Mhm.
as less about building an AI to replace a doctor, which I think is like the simplistic
Right.
way to say it. It's much more about thinking. Something we don't talk about enough is design, and what the new design paradigm I think is that we're entering into might look like. And
Mhm.
so I'm not sure about you. I'd love to get your take as well. But for me, when I think about building a product, there is a kind of end to end spectrum that you're building for. And so I'm thinking a lot more, even I would have told you I think about experiences in the past, but I think right now with the cost of kind of generating a pixel and an AI and like that's becoming commoditized, which I think means that the durable advantage over time is going to be about experience and trust and like
Right.
that. And so while we have AI in the name, it's actually much more of a symbiosis between AI and communities and experts and people. And the anchor point, the principal anchor point is trust. And so, what does engendering trust for a patient? How do you earn that? How do you maintain that? How do you not keep from veering off into a pole like we were talking about before, which can happen with AI and
Yeah.
hallucinations? And so, I'm really anchoring on how do you make a super trusted product? And maybe that's an entry point into some of the stuff we had touched on in our last conversation.
Well, so I want to talk a little bit about the information asymmetry because I think that's a really good way to put it. And in general, abstracting it away from medicine, the reason people go and hunt down experts is intentionally for the information asymmetry, where they realize that they are at a disadvantage and in some potential way. And so they go find the expert, and the expert is the one that helps bridge that gap in terms of the asymmetry so that the person who sought the expert is able to operate at a higher level, right?
Yeah.
And when you are a patient and you are talking with a doctor, there is an extraordinary amount of asymmetry because even for me, I have a biology degree. I was an EMT for a while. I went through cancer treatment with my son, which was 3.5 years, and that included a fungal infection. And then there was epilepsy as well. I've had my own significant struggles with my mental health because of bipolar. And my wife has had some of her own struggles. And even with years and years and years and years of experience, when I sit down with a doctor, and I don't think of myself as a dummy. When I sit down with a doctor, I still know far less than that doctor does because they're very
Yeah.
focused on a specific thing and they have trained for it. But it's really interesting when you start talking about the information asymmetry and using AI to solve that. Because the project I'm working on right now, we literally started out to build expert agents. And the very first thing that I identified as we were building that system is that the input data, the input material is the hardest part.
Yeah.
It is the information that goes into the expert system that is the defining factor of how
Mm,
well it operates. And so I'm sitting here as I ponder it, I'm like, this is a really good way to frame it for people, which is not that AI is going to solve everything because it certainly won't, right? It is as flawed as humans, if not more so. And humans
yeah.
won't solve everything. But
Right.
it's also like if you think of it as a tool that is going to reduce the information asymmetry gap, it's actually just a lot easier to conceive of. And
Yeah.
so, and listen, you and I both know I have sat in front of doctors and had them tell me things. And I've looked right at them and said, you're wrong. And you're going to go back to the drawing board on this one because
Mm,
I know you're wrong. And
yeah.
it's interesting because in those moments, there's like a shock that occurs in the eyes of the doctor if it's the first time anybody's ever done it to them, because
Yep.
everybody treats them like they're perfect up until
Yeah.
they're not perfect, or up until somebody says you're not perfect.
Yeah.
And really honestly, the question is what begins the collapsing of the asymmetry in and of itself.
Yeah, it's a really good way to put it. I had a similar experience where this is when I was going through cancer, and I
Yeah.
remember distinctly that the first line of treatment, it had seemed, did not work.
Yeah.
And I had asked my primary oncologist about probabilities, like the probabilities conversation, because I've got
Mhm.
3 kiddos.
Yeah.
And he told me a number, and I was okay. He said something like 80%. And I'm like,
Right.
I mean, that's not good, but okay. Then I got a second opinion at Stanford, and the number they gave me was 30%. And those are not, you don't have to be a statistician to know those are not the
Those
same
are not
thing.
close.
I nearly collapsed when I heard that. What it turned out was that the primary oncologist, this is just how thorny it can get. And
Yeah.
he sort of gave me a half answer because he didn't multiply the probabilities. And so he was telling me the chemo works 80%, but then you have to do a stem cell after that. Anyway, it's not going worth going into it. But the point is that who do you trust ends up really becoming this big thing. And so you can trust implicitly, you can partially trust, you can not
Yeah.
trust. There's a whole range there that maybe isn't worth getting into or we could come back to. But I had a few sort of thoughts on your how do you build, you were saying that you built a AI system and the inputs was kind of the hard part.
Yeah.
And just a few quick things to say. I agree with you. The inputs is sort of a challenge. And maybe if I just decompose trust for a minute and just
Mhm.
think about it in those terms, something that actually I saw at the company we worked at
Mhm.
was there was a little bit of a paradox for me in leading some second opinion areas. I don't know if we talked about this ever,
Mm-mm.
but one was that you mentioned information and we're talking about collapsing the information asymmetry.
Yeah.
And I think that's all good. My observation was that it is necessary but insufficient. So the information itself will go a particular amount of distance. But something that I found puzzling, and I won't go in too much detail, but just to say that we had very high MPS scores, like unreasonably high qualitative patient feedback scores, some of the products. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized it was not so much actually about the quality of the information or kind of
Mhm.
shrinking that gap. It really was some of the human touch. And actually, paradoxically, to a lot of the conversations that we have, it was the frontline, lowest kind of paid worker answering the calls, empathizing with patients
Mhm.
in a system that doesn't really give them more than a few minutes at a time. You're kind of anonymous widget in a machine.
Mhm.
And so I think that went a long way toward engendering trust. So there's almost like these two meta components, the human piece, the empath, the soft skill,
Yeah.
bedside manner, call it a bunch of things, and the actual information. And so I think while one could nail the information piece of it's necessary but insufficient to get you all the way to the trust, sort of squaring the trust, squaring that circle.
Yeah.
So that's one.
Let me
The
let me
other, yeah,
can I talk to that real quick? Because I was gonna talk I was actually gonna say something about that, but I decided to skip it, which is that the one difference in healthcare is that it is very, very, very difficult to divest yourself the emotional and
yeah,
physical well-being. Like, I need to survive. I need my child to survive. I need my spouse to survive. And so that is a factor specifically to healthcare that
mhm,
is like you don't overcome that with more information. You can't.
right,
And to your point, the care that you receive, and in this instance, we're talking about like the human touch element, is often what makes the difference. And so those people, and I am in no way, shape, or form shocked that the NPS scores were extraordinarily high because of the frontline call folks that we
yeah,
had, because they were very
yeah,
good.
yeah.
They were very empathetic.
They were
They were
incredibly good.
amazing.
I shadowed them subsequently, but a little bit of a just a side branch that we'll come back to
Yeah.
is that the reason I went down that kind of rabbit hole in trying to assess and understand why those were so high was because a lot of the overhead, if you want to think of it as OpEx or cost of goods,
Yeah.
was going into the clinical elements, the partnerships and the records collection and the compiling information, all this stuff. And really the question I was asking is how do you drive margin on a product that otherwise is performing incredibly well. And when I started asking what components could I cut from the OPEX, let's say, or from the cost of goods on the product, the answer I was met with is a chorus of, no, you can't cut this and can't cut that. And you need every record and like this. And I'm, well, which record would you cut? And just a basic question. No, no, we need them all.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go down that and you wind that down, what you really wind up with is, well, actually, it's not so much. It's hard to tease them apart, kind of retrospectively or however you want to think about it. But it was very clear that in shadowing some of those frontline workers, they really were driving a disproportionate amount of the value from a qualitative perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And most importantly, that actually isn't the important part. The most important part is nobody knew that or wasn't crediting the value for that. And so you cut those people, which is the wrong thing to do.
It is. And to that point, I could just sit here and I hear Zoom calls that we were both in where, product and engineering are like congratulating themselves that the NPS scores are so incredibly high. And it's because
Yeah,
of
yeah. I might not have been on that particular Zoom call because that wasn't what I was doing.
Yeah. So no, no, no. But like the point being is that, and this goes back to our first discussion where it's like, you got to put the patient first, but oftentimes putting the patient first means that you're spending money on things that are seemingly inefficient.
That's right. And hard to attribute value
Yeah.
to for
Yeah.
the system that you're optimizing on. And that's all fine. That is to be expected. I think you should just know where the value come, like if
Right.
you think about the value chain, it's important to understand which
Yeah.
piece drives what is kind of the net point of it. And in building trust, that would be maybe a discounted dimension. Let's just call it vis-a-vis the information itself. But coming back to the information, I had maybe one or two other quick things to say
Yeah.
on that in terms of maybe an observation and then like a piece on at least the approach I've been taking on how do you start with that information with something as high, I don't know, severity and urgency as maybe like cancer care.
Mhm.
But in thinking about information, there's another thing to say, which is information. I kind of have this chart in my mind, which
Mhm.
is first off, it's not static, right? It's a moving train, this whole information thing.
Right.
And so I sort of have these two lines on a chart, just use your imagination for a second. And you've got kind of a linear line,
Mhm.
going slightly sloping up, and that is the pace of adoption with respect to new innovations from provider groups, a new test, a new
Sure.
treatment. Those take a long time. There's a lot of trials and regulatory hurdles that have to be overcome, animal models, before you get there. On the other hand, you have this just breathtaking compounding, an exponential curve on top of that, which is just the world that we're in. I mean, you were showing me your shock system on your watch. I don't know if that counts necessarily, but the LLMs and the
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been spending a lot of time in the diagnostics world and looking at the frontier of
Yeah.
diagnostic tests, blood tests with ML models on top of them,
Mhm.
AlphaFold. Like when I was at UCSF, I had a few people that were working on crystallography, which is like a way to get a snapshot, particular protein conformation or a piece of a
Mhm.
protein. And it would take a whole postdoc. It would take 2 years, and you would be a little bit wrong, and it would be just a subset of that protein conformation, which is a really complex thing. And
Mhm.
now you have AlphaFold that can do this in just breathtaking resolution and just getting better all the time.
Yep.
And so you're just stacking these different CRISPR and gene editing and all these things on the life sciences side of the house. And then you could explode that. And there's a bunch of things in life sciences. There's a bunch of things in compute and LLMs. And those things are stacking. And there's just this crazy evolution across the board,
Mhm.
quantum chips, like you name it. And these things are just all layering on top of one another. And so the amount of daylight between those two curves is just going to be increasing over time.
Yeah.
And so as we're thinking about information asymmetries and like that, what that leaves is a problem, let's call it a possibility space for, let's just talk about patients that
Mhm.
are somewhere between those two curves. And sometimes that adoption line from the providers, even that's a little bit fuzzy because you have uneven
Mhm.
adoption of various guidelines that we could get into.
Yeah.
But what is possible for patients is running away from what they're actually getting. And so that leaves a bit of an opportunity cost, maybe an opportunity, but a lot of uncertainty, let's just say, in terms of what is that information parity with a doctor with the latest science? What even is that? How do you even think about that?
Yeah.
And where does that go? And who knows? I don't know where that goes, but I'm pretty sure that it would be weird if in 5 years we're here and nothing fundamental has shifted. Then again, that's sort of a famous refrain in healthcare, so you never know.
Yeah.
But I do get the sense that we're in a moment that is a bit of an inflection here.
Yeah. I agree with you. For better or worse, and who knows if this will be the case in 2 years, given, the crazy pants guy that's in charge of, health and human services. But you want medicine to kind of move slow.
You also want a constitution that moves slow. Like there's a lot of things
Yeah,
that
there's
you
things like
shouldn't disrupt.
it's a feature. It's not a bug. And
I totally agree with that.
and so if you end up like, yes, you're right, because the things we're going to be capable of, if you want to look at it differently versus the things that we're doing, they
Yeah.
are going to continue to increase, right? And I think you're right. I think it may be an exponential difference.
There's a third line in there that we didn't
Mhm.
talk about, which is the dotted line between the two.
Yeah.
And I think the net of it is like, okay, I think we would probably all agree that, say it was, you're advocating for your son or yourself
Mhm.
or, your parent, you pretty much don't want to be on, kind of the frontier on the exponential.
Right.
It's probably also true that you don't want to be
Yeah,
at the
on the big
standard of
line.
care a lot of the time. And it turns out a lot of the patient kind of populations I've been dealing with are what I think of as they've run out of sort of road on the standard of care. So we're dealing with like really
Really
advanced,
sick.
prostate, pancreatic, stage 4 clinical trials
Yeah.
using off-label drugs, like sort of, it's you were talking about getting emotional. And when I do patient interviews, I've built a lot of products and I don't get choked up the way I do when I talk to a late stage kind of terminal patient who is, number one, I mean, just giving me the time of day. You have limited time. So, I mean, that's one. But number two, to say, I wish I had a thing like this, a few years ago, it's really incredible. And it's easy to lose sight of the power of technology. Everything's AI, everything's this and that. But actually, some technologies can really make a giant difference in people's lives. And so that's a lot of where I think that keeps me grounded. Also, we have WhatsApp groups. Like I have a WhatsApp group of patients, the good, the bad, and the ugly patient
Yeah.
feedback. And it's incredibly useful. But people die, like literally. Like, have you been in a Slack group that people die? Anyway, it keeps me like really grounded. But
Well, and this transition almost feels cold after that. And it is hard to express how important the human element is, right? As both you and I have been on the other side of this, as we're sitting and we have sat in the offices wondering if we're going to die or our child is going to die. And like the emotional ups and downs of that entire system is mind boggling. It's mind boggling. People talk about startup life is a roller coaster. Well, friend, I'm here to tell you that the number of highs and the number of lows that can exist in a single day in the cancer world is awful. It's just no other way because the highs are high and the lows are very low. But, one of the things when we talked about it, as I was literally walking down a trail and we were on the phone, was you all are so as you're trying to attempt to close this information asymmetry, right? To give the patients the ability to access expertise and knowledge that they would not be able to access in general because
or
they're
not easily anyway.
not easily, right? And for what it's worth, to get the best healthcare, you have to be an asshole. Like it's just and it's unfortunate, but the squeaky wheel gets the most oil. And if
Yeah.
you are the patient that will not let it go, you are going to get the better care. But it's hard and it takes strength of will and fortitude that most patients just don't have.
Yeah.
So
Nor, by the way, just final
yeah,
point on that, because you're completely right. And another thing that really bothers me is that, number one, that is true. And number two, the fact that needs to be true is such a failure,
right.
right? Because most patients will not be that person. I was that person for sure. It saved me a lot of anguish and pain, but it was
Yeah.
probably the hardest thing I ever did. And I feel like I had every advantage in my corner to do that. So it's not reasonable to think that a lot of people are going to get there. One question is, can you reduce the amount of friction overhead in enabling people to get there? Because I actually have, again, like a bit of a belief that there is so much needless friction in getting people to just do something that they would do in any other domain of their life, fixing a car, you name it. And it's like, it's needlessly cumbersome. And so I think there is some amount of lift that technology can do to minimize some of that gap and get people to a place that they can be more engaged.
So one of the things that, as we talked about that y'all are doing, you're effectively layering LLMs in order to come to a place where you can reliably, and that's the key. That's the key, is
That
reliably
is the key.
with a significant reduction in hallucinations. You cannot have the robot lying in this field. So you have, like, you told me about this matrix that you put together where you'll have the cancer, on one side, I don't know, maybe it's a cube. You've got the different models and you've got the outcome, right? The
Yeah.
truthfulness of the outcome. And you were telling me how you run these, like, basically tests over and over to see if a different combination of models will be better at different cancers or different subtypes of cancers.
Yep.
And I was floored because, one of as I have sat back and thought about how do I test the system I'm building, right? When I know that every single interaction with the robot that we have built is foundationally built upon this idea that we're going to leverage some kind of emergent behavior in order to come up with an insight or an action that was not
Mm,
obvious. Well, the hard thing
mm,
about testing the not obvious is that you cannot predict with any
yeah.
significant accuracy the emergent behavior or the non-obvious answer.
That's a perfect jumping off point
Yeah.
is twist and turn and kind of getting there. Also, I don't claim that I have the answer. This is a
Nobody
fast
does.
moving landscape. But what I'll say is that from a product principle perspective, as I mentioned earlier, I
Mhm.
think about trust. I take it seriously. I think about what would I trust? What would I, trust literally cancer patients that I'm talking to in real situations? Would I trust getting them onto this platform and what they're going to get on the other side of it? There's probably a few dimensions to break this on. Like one is how do you actually go about testing it? And so I do a lot of patient tests, looking over their shoulders and having them like literally to break it with their hardest questions is like one really good way to do it.
Mhm.
But in terms of the approach, I think I started out thinking number one, this is such a basic observation, but what does every cancer patient have in common? They basically all have questions. And so that's one way to just start a
Mhm.
solid footing. Yeah, it's likely that you have a question.
Mhm.
Now you can then think about maybe a triage process of question types.
Mhm.
What is a question? Decompose a question.
Mhm.
And you can have an escalation path. And so that's one way that I've thought about this is almost like, well, does the AI have to do everything? What is AI good for? What is AI not good for?
Mhm.
And so there's an escalation path actually that we built in. This is before I actually go into the AI piece,
Yeah.
just at a higher level on the problem space, is sort of don't lie, be truthful,
Right.
and be honest and transparent. These are all kind of just core
Mhm.
principles. But there are going to be some sets of questions that actually, not even sets of questions. I want to rewind and just tell you another way on the trust thing that
Mhm.
dovetails with our conversation about the frontline workers that we had a few
Mhm.
minutes ago. And that is that do I trust some text on a page? It could be perfect. It could be perfect prose. It could be right. It could be from the world expert. I don't know that that gets me all the way to trust. I almost think of it like a pyramid of trust where it's like, okay, I'm going to have the experts and at the very tippy top, like, what does the world expert say about the thing? And is that right? And then in the middle, maybe you've got some domain experts. This is what I did in my own
Mhm.
care. And then at the bottom is like people that are really smart generalists that could help me think about a general class of problem. How
Yeah.
would you approach it? What's a piece of data that you need? And so, in a way, you can transcend oncology in a way to just getting like what is the strike zone of right and what should I be optimizing on? And so that's just like a mental model going into this.
Mhm.
Now, in terms of the AI,
Mhm.
the approach that I kind of took, I also hit up the same problem in the early days that you were
Mhm.
articulating with the hallucination and like that. But I have a little bit of an advantage in that I have a giant patient community, and my co-founder is a big kind of cancer advocate and like that. And so what I ended up doing was actually generating a corpus of questions by cancer type. What are the top 10 questions patients should ask that don't ask,
Mhm.
your regrettable non-asked questions. I wish I had asked this a
Mhm.
million years ago and it would have changed the course of my treatment.
Mhm.
And so kind of generated that corpus of questions, then further segmented it down into kind of classified types. Hardcore medical questions, care navigation questions, emotional support questions. There's a range of those, and you can classify those. And you can actually kind of, when you're running evals, and we can go into like evals, but you can almost pre-classify by like, what's the type of question? What's the cancer type? What
Mhm.
do we know? How much do we know? How much do we not know? And then sort of approximate truth on the other side. The reason, by the way, like, I'm actually trying to be as simple and obvious as possible. So the thing that I observed was that the frontier models are coming at me faster than I could possibly know. Are they improvements? Are they regressions? Do I have to take your word for it? How would I know? And so
Right.
the approach I took was just from a simple observation that as somebody building a product that ought to be high trust, how can I know I'm not building on quicksand?
Right.
The only way would be either I build some robust eval, which is what I ended up doing, or I stay on the same models that
I'm
I know
working.
and trust
Yeah.
after the new ones are moving pace.
Mhm.
And so the eval system is where I ended up kind of spending a bunch of time in cycles.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if you want to go into it. I'm happy to like go.
I would love to go into the nuts and bolts of the eval system. I mean, we're definitely we're coming up on time a little bit, but I actually would love to get into like how it works
Yeah.
specifically and the ways that you guys utilize it. So,
So, right. So, exactly. So, I mean, at a basic level, a user is going to ask a question. We call it the Navis AI. It's a RAG system. So, I built out a RAG
mhm.
system with I've got clinical folks on my team as well. And so, what I call tier one trustable documents? So, in many cases, that's what's called the NCCN guidelines. The details don't matter, from the National Cancer Institute or other ASCO, you have these very high trust used
Mhm.
by doctors, medical professionals, kind of standards.
Mhm.
So what'll happen is the user will ask a question, will generate like a query embedding basically, on the RAG system and then do the matching. By the way, I'm using Supabase, kind of a
Okay.
Postgres. I don't
Yeah.
know if you are familiar. I love it.
Uh,
I think it's fantastic.
yeah, and I mean, I haven't looked directly at Super. We're using Postgres with actually a vector addition.
Yeah.
So but
Same,
yeah,
same. It's the same idea.
yeah,
So I think it's PG Vector is the
yeah, PG
library,
vector.
something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's what
PG Vector. Supabase is just a nicer, friendlier version of Postgres. Like
okay,
basically, it's a layer on top of Postgres. The way I think about it, because I've
okay.
wrangled Postgres in the past, and it can be not fun, nor where I want to spend my time, nor where I'm going to make any impact.
Postgres is my
Well,
boy, man. I love it. I use it for
it's
everything.
it's wonderful, but the
But I'm
point
an
is that
engineer.
yeah, I'm trying to not do that because I'm wearing a lot of hats here.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like, so what I need is really a system that I can, over time, know, am I moving in the right direction vis-a-vis trust and
mhm,
like that. And so we'll do some cancer type filtering because we've got some of those inputs from patients. And so
mhm,
I think we've done a tasteful way of collecting sort of that value exchange, take some information, give more tuned results. And then we'll also have like a little thing right now. It's exposed to patients, which is kind of dumb because patients don't need to think about which model do I want to use. Do I want to use,
right. Mhm,
GPT-5, like whatever number, whatever model it is. But as you were alluding to, so then just to close that out, so then we'll calculate along a set of dimensions that we can go into what the scores actually are. And so we produce like a trust score
mhm,
and then return that response back from whatever model we're using to the patient. And so you can kind of tap in, again, transparency. So try to be
mhm,
transparent of which dimension was what, why is this low?
mhm,
We can go into that, but that's the basic flow here. And so some of those dimensions would be things like source support. So I classified tier one, tier two, tier three, some arbitrary. I should mention that all of this is like, I think of it like a starting point
mhm,
where you can have a methodical iteration process and
mhm,
improvement. But so we'll have some weights along the various dimensions. You'll have how complete is the response, how fitted is the response to the question. Did you like hit the points? I asked about a biomarker. Did you address the biomarker?
mhm,
How trustworthy is it? Communication. So, like using what grade level? Actually, the user can tune that. And how accurate is it? Which I think is currently the highest weight, but I have a whole dashboard in the back. You can tune
right.
the weights depending. So that's going to be learnings that we're going to do over time. to figure out, well, what's the optimal? But what you can say from that is a few, I think, tactical, actionable things.
Hmm.
Number one, also, I'm happy to go whatever rabbit hole
Oh,
you
you're
want
good.
on
You're
any
good.
of those
Yeah, yeah.
pieces. So, what do you get at the end? You can build out, as you said, kind of a pivot or a cube or whatever you want to call it. You can start segmenting down by cancer type, by dimension, by subtype, even if you
Hmm.
want, by frontier model. And you can start looking at the hot spots. Where are we good? Where are we weak? Oh, you can actually add the category as well, as we were
Right.
describing. So, is this a hardcore medical question, care? And you can look at where are you good? Where are you not good? How does this help me? Number one, it helps me know where are we more trustworthy? Where are we less trustworthy? If, for example, I'm thinking about one I was looking at the other day, if you're looking at your source support, source completeness, where are we failing with respect to source material on, I think it was like kidney cancer or something like that? Like
Hmm.
we just didn't have enough data in there to really say, oh, yeah, like I think I'd forgotten to pull in kidney cancer NCCN guidelines or something like that.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of flag and identify those things. A couple of layers on top of that as
Hmm.
well, then further pipe into the system. Qualitative feedback, as you would expect, a thumbs
Hmm.
up, a thumbs down, qual feedback from patients. And then increasingly, one thing we're doing is calibration with clinicians to then expose each question, each score, we save them all and
Hmm.
have them sort of sample the space. And does this calibration seem right? And so we can then kind of manually tune it with expert, human in the loop, whatever you want to
Hmm.
call it. But in that way, the net of it is now I have a system where I've got new frontier models coming out every day. Looking on the Hugging Face, I'm looking on the, should I switch to this one or that one? In a weird way, we're like building our own mini like Hugging Face for this little tiny niche
Hmm.
of, cancer stuff. But we can also generate sort of, I think, gold standard types of answers to many of the commonly asked questions because you just don't have to repeat yourself all the time. If you're diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer, I'm pretty sure we've got all the questions you need to ask and should be asking.
Wow.
The clinical trials, which ones are relevant? Well, that's going to change. But should you be asking about which ones and this biomarker? And so we can be tuning also the kind of most frequently asked questions and actually producing more static-ish kind of content to
Mhm.
spare, further API calls and like that. In my mind, it's a fairly straightforward system, and to keep it that way. Actually, one thing I did notice on to pull back on your hallucination thing that you were
Mhm.
talking about with the machine you were building. Originally, I had an LLM, uh, a cheap fast. I think it was Claude Haiku or something,
Yeah.
like evaluating
The
the,
answer.
on
Yeah.
the return trip, something like that. And I was like, crap, I can't reproduce this. And it was like two things that are very simple because I'm a product guy. It's like,
Interesting.
hey,
Yeah.
I can't reproduce it. And, obviously it costs whatever, a hundred
Yes,
cents
it
or
is
whatever.
extra. It is definitely extra.
But it was the latency. It was like, my God, this is taking like,
Yeah.
and it's because I probably didn't optimize it well, and I'm not trying to. I'm sure there's
No,
ways around that. But the
no.
latency was
Yeah.
just, man, that's just unacceptable. And so
We
I ended up
and
going,
we are dealing with significant latency issues, and so even though we trust the truthiness of a lot of the answers, the latency has reached a point where we're going to have to like significantly start looking at how to the system. And we've
yeah,
got a new type of agent that we're going to be deploying pretty soon, and I don't know if it's going to I really don't know how it's going to perform in terms of latency, but we're effectively moving to self-contained agents that have full access to this and also have a Python environment that they will be able to utilize to do analysis and look at things. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
now at this point, we're moving so far away from a RAG based system because what we accidentally built was a vibe coding platform. And so we're
Mm,
starting to put our emphasis not so much on the answers that we're getting back, but putting the emphasis on the work that the robot can do.
yeah,
Yeah,
which seems it seems
totally.
right. It's not clear to me, by the way, where we net out. Like at some point,
Mhm.
the I have a rag system because I have a lot of content that I want to make
Oh,
sure is
we
preferentially
still
treated.
yeah, we still
Yeah,
have a RAG system. And as a matter of fact, like we're augmenting that RAG system constantly. And
yeah,
ironically, now we're doing some very large scale crawling. The funny part is that we are adding to the RAG system at an exponential
yeah,
rate.
yeah.
So
That
there's
that
so,
actually that I think that's kind of where I was going
yeah.
is that I mean, there's challenges in maintenance and pruning, right? It could be that you have to cut things that are no longer trustable. It could be that you're missing things that are trustable. So there's a maintenance gap
Mhm.
question. The other thing is that at what point do the frontier models just supersede a frontier model? So the thing I haven't run yet that I want to
Yeah.
run is, just running, the newest model at some point,
Yeah.
Grok, whatever,
Yeah.
against and see how does it net out. So there's a lot of, I think the thing that I'm most concerned with or most keen on with the system is that it's at least understandable and iterable.
Mhm.
Whereas otherwise, I would feel like I'm building a product that anchors on trust on kind of a quicksand or a black box that I can't understand. And so this at least allows me to have a solid footing in a world that increasingly feels like I don't know. I don't know if you're regret. I don't know if it's generally 90% better, but you've regressed in some other area. I don't know how I would evaluate something like that when GPT-6 and 7 come
Yeah.
out versus, what we have here. And so that feels important for me.
For so and probably we probably do need to wrap it up, but that is definitely a very I want to touch on that just a sec, which is the risk profile of the thing that I'm building is different than the risk profile of the thing that you're building. And I would consider your risk profile to be exceptionally high because the likelihood of some kind of unfortunate event based on information that your robot returns is it's high. You have to get it right.
That's right.
And minimal failures are really not an option.
Yeah.
With the thing, and here's the other thing, but you're also focused on answers. You're focused on generative texts. And there's a different measurement issue there.
Not
For us,
actually.
go ahead.
Oh, to
Yeah.
chime in, not only actually one of the things that I'm trying to build in here, and this
Mhm.
feels like new paradigms a little bit experientially, which is I should have said that every score that comes in, I then discount it by 40%. So they
Right.
all kind
Yeah.
of look like normalized. Like there is no really super high confidence answer when it comes to hardcore medical questions. But what
Right.
we do,
Yeah.
the other piece that we're
Mhm.
doing is, you build in the caveats and all this stuff that you would expect, but actually part of the value is back to our thing about trust and like information and information
Mhm.
asymmetry. I think ultimately information gets you to a point, but what we really want to do is get the handshake going to what are you actually trying to do? So you could go to ChatGPT and upload your pathology. I've done it. I've done it with Claude
Yeah.
3.7. I mean, Claude 3.7 actually was better than my primary onc, which just gives you a sense. That was, a bunch of months
Wow.
ago, maybe a year ago.
Yeah.
That's just N of one. But what we're doing is also connecting patients with resources on the other side that are relevant to the questions that they're asking. And so that can look then like that, how I mentioned that
Mhm.
escalation path is you can actually connect with community members
Right.
that are, maybe a few miles down the road that you're about to embark on. I
Mhm.
was just diagnosed with prostate cancer, and we
Yeah.
have somebody that was 6 months ago diagnosed with prostate cancer and they're open to mentoring, which many cancer patients are. Would
Yeah.
it be useful for you to connect with that person?
Yeah.
Yes. We have other advocacy groups that are relevant to that particular
Right.
cancer type or that issue or emotional health
Mhm.
coaches, whatever it actually is. It's sort of getting you to that next step. So it's
Mhm.
not just leaving you like GPT is great, but number one, it's hard
Wow.
to know do I trust it or Facebook groups, high signal to noise. But like connect me, like what do I do about this thing? Because then you've got this giant yawning chasm between like where you leave off with GPT and then okay, what do I do? I
Well,
gotta go phone
and
my
if you
uncle to go get this thing.
yeah, if you think about it, what you've done is it's not an answer machine anymore. So from
Correct.
a pure like risk profile, you now reduced your risk profile significantly,
Yes.
but the product is more human. It's fuller, and by putting those people in the loop, you can put three people in the room, tell them each the same story, and they will have three different reactions. And if two people are like, "No, I'm pretty sure that's illegal," and one person is like, "Oh yeah, we should totally do that," like
It's
you're
totally
gonna
true.
yeah, you're gonna ask some question of the
You,
guy that
when
was like, "Yeah, we should
when I was
definitely."
when I was about that pyramid
Yeah.
idea, that was the idea is that you're triangulating on what the right answer is rather than relying on a single kind of vector, so to speak, of like this is truth and it's the gospel coming from the LLM. It's actually more like you ever draw a picture like a face or a
Mhm.
portrait Like if you try to do it with a line, it's going to look terrible. You're shading and you're like this, and kind of getting to the truth is a little bit of that where you're knocking around with like community, asking around. It's not a
Mhm.
linear kind of path. You talk to one expert, then there's this. I think of cancer increasingly as a multiplayer game or like a team
Right.
sport. And I think that's the difference in just ethos that at least I'm trying to think about with respect to building a platform that helps patients is how do you enable that multiplayer sort of approach to something that is fundamentally complex and does not
Yeah.
lend itself to a answer machine, so to speak. So in a way, we're going around it. Hopefully we're going through it at the same time in terms of making the AI good. But I'm not trying to. I think it's a single point of failure. Just would be too devastating without some of the wraparound other elements that I think are fundamental to creating a great experience for patients.
And honestly, I think that's a good place to leave it because, the thing that you have done. So, and, there's so much more we could talk about. But I think it's important to note that the thing that you have built, this technological marvel, is just one piece of the entire system. And to a degree, it's an important piece, but it's a small piece. In isolation, that thing is, extraordinarily important if that's the only thing you offered. But the fact that you offer other human contact, the fact that you offer other people to listen, other people to see, other people to answer, that I can now, if I'm part of one of these communities, I can take the answer and say, what do you guys think?
Yeah,
Right? You
exactly. That's
by
exactly it.
embedding this technological marvel within a community of humans, you have now it is now greater than the sum of its parts
Yeah,
because the
yeah.
community of humans is definitely powerful. And this robot that you've built is also very powerful, but the two of them together are
Yeah.
probably that it
I
is much more powerful.
I I think and really the thing that we're not talking enough about is how I think design of products. We actually started out, product is turning into eng to
Mhm.
product. They're all kind of merging. And I think the dynamic in play is that the ability to build pixels is sort of becoming a commodity.
Yes.
I'm saying that to the engineer.
No, it is.
You can
No,
you can
actually,
wrap me at it, but I think the ability to build the distribution and the
Mhm.
durable advantage. And like really where I'm coming at it from is how do you build a very trustable system? AI is a very important part of it, but I don't think you win with the AI. And the next it's enough to sort of build a better version of an AI in the future, but I think it's the combination, as you rightly articulated.
to
That's
to
where the experience is.
to your point, building the pixels is the commodity. We've hit the point
Yeah,
where really anybody can do it.
yeah,
The next phase of the commoditization of software is assembling the system. And we're really close to that being
yeah,
a commodity as well.
yeah. It's moving really fast.
And like look, I have put together, I've dealt with huge scalable systems, and I'm here to tell you that there's a few of these systems I probably would have never been able to build on my own, but I think I could build them now
Yeah,
because,
yeah,
and it would just be me sitting down with the
yeah,
robot and saying, this is how we're going to deploy it, this is what we're going to do. I work with my AWS backend from Claude Code, and work with the robot to build the Terraform, which we then use to deploy.
yeah.
And I've built my dream deployment system as a result.
Mm,
And
mm.
so, for every PR, we stand up a whole environment for it that has a copy of the production database that you can then go in and test with, right? It is a full representation of what the
Yeah,
system will be once it ships. But beyond that is how do you build a product?
yeah,
We're
yep,
nowhere near a
yeah,
robot taking that over. And so, even if we take the core skills of what it means to be an engineer, we've commoditized the code that's being written. We're in the process of commoditizing the systems that are being built. And I think that one's going to take a lot longer. And also, the risk of failure on that kind of thing is extraordinarily expensive, right? I do not see a world where we just outsource the product to the robot.
yeah,
And, the robot is not necessarily going to generate the idea. And
yeah,
so, going back to the engineers and PMs collapsing together, that's why. Because the good engineers know how to build a product, and
yeah,
the good product managers know how to build a product, right?
yeah,
And as I'm sitting here on my side of it going, I might should get better at product because if
Well,
I don't, will I have a job?
maybe even sharpen up the product side, which is, I really think of it as where do you backstop on durable advantage? Like, what's your moat in a world where the building of pixels, zero? I think it's really like distribution on the one hand, and I think it's
Mhm.
trust on the other. And, as we've been talking about trust, really it's trust in my mind that is it, the durable advantage. That's the thing that I have to squint the hardest to see how that gets commoditized.
Mhm.
But I mean, I generally agree with you. And thanks for having me on. It's been a
Yeah,
pleasure.
man. Hey, this was fun. I'm glad we did it. And here's the thing: Thanos wasn't here, so we could actually like gaze at our belly buttons and really like get super philosophical. He never would have let us do it. He's a terrible person. So,
Send my regards, and happy to do a round two.
all right, humans of
All right.
Earth, thank you for coming along on Will AI Snap That. My name is Michael Rollins, and I am not joined by Thanos, he of the Snapdom. But today we were joined by Ari Akerstein, who is telling us how the human element within healthcare is the most important part. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We bid you adieu.